Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Let's talk about the Iran nuclear deal. When during the President Barack Obama's administration, the administration reached a historic deal that was dubbed as such, being historic because the adversary or the other side the US was making deal with was Iran. And it was struck between Iran and the United States on certain conditions with the backing of the world's powers, including Germany, France, China, and Russia as well. That was known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. So later on, we saw after President Donald Trump took over the administration, he reversed that deal. And in retaliation to that, Iran started enriching uranium much beyond the limits of those limits which were actually mentioned in that particular deal. Later on, we saw another change in the administration. President Joe Biden came into power, and there was a little hope that the Iran nuclear deal could be revived. Back-to-back talks happened between the two sides with the backing of the similar world powers, including Germany, France, Russia, and China. And a number of sessions on those talks happened in Vienna, which resulted in nothing but to the dismay of both the parties. But at the same time, both the parties had been accusing each other of backing away from the promises that they made in that particular deal. And now we saw another fresh round of talks between Iran and the US, and the talks were held in Doha, but those talks also didn't come to any sort of fruition. Rather than that there could be a revival of that deal through those talks, US has imposed new sanctions on certain entities and individuals which are related to the petroleum and the petrochemical industry of Iran, which has been, of course, condemned by the Iranian officials. Let's talk about this particular burning issue in detail. And for that, I am joined in the studio by Dr. Karel Vereycken, who is the senior analyst. Dr. Vereycken, thank you very much for your time at Views on News. And I'm also being joined on the phone line from Iran, Mr. Mustafa Khushchesham, who is Iran Affairs Analyst. Mr. Khushchesham, thank you very much for your time at Views on News as well. And I'm also being joined from France on Skype by Mr. Karel Vereycken, who is a political analyst from Schiller Institute. Thank you, all of you, for your time. I'll begin the discussion with you, Mr. Khushchesham. How do you think, has there been any shift of policy with the change of administration? Because we saw the policy of maximum pressure during the Donald Trump administration. There were hopes that once there is a regime change in the US and President Joe Biden takes over the reign, there could be a little bit of shift in the policy. What do you think? Okay, well, we are trying to connect to Mr. Mustafa Khushchesham. As soon as he joins, we'll go to him. Dr. Vereycken, what do you think? There was a huge expectation of the shift in the foreign policy towards Iran when it came to the revival of the Iran nuclear deal, in particular on the part of the US administration. Do you think there was any shift or a sincere effort by the US administration in order to revive that deal?
I think the first sincere effort that was made was by Barack Obama. Obama had made it his foreign policy principle to actually go for nuclear zero. And he made a very famous speech in Prague in 2009 in which he said he is for the elimination of nuclear weapons. But as we know that after he completed his 2 terms, 8 years, he was replaced by Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, all of us know, was a very populist person, and sometimes his behavior in the realm of foreign policy appeared to be irrational, because he would pass judgments or statements on Twitter without even consulting with his State Department. So he backed out of the deal in 2018. What one was expecting was that this deal that is known as JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, would retard or delay the Iranian pursuit of a nuclear weapon for perhaps a dozen years or so. And there were a lot of technical things that were put in. For example, the fissile material that they had already with them was to be diverted for the production of electricity elsewhere. In any case, Iranians were happy because some of their assets were being unfrozen, and they could buy technology, their commercial.
So what do you think? What led Donald Trump to reverse that deal? If it was sort of a win-win situation for both the parties, so what were those basic irritants that actually made him reverse the deal?
Basically, Israeli pressure. Israelis never wanted this deal to take place. Israelis and Iranians are so enemies to each other. So Israelis never, even when Obama was striking this deal, they were against it. They said this is a bad deal. The word that they were using consistently was that it was a bad deal. So Trump is one person who we know that his son-in-law was a Jew, and he was the one who floated the idea of the Abraham Accords. And he was, all American administrations are friendly to Israel, but he was over-friendly to Israel. He was the one who moved his embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he was the one who actually favored new illegal settlements in the occupied territories. And one of the, I think, areas where the buildings were coming up were named as Trump Heights or something like that. So Trump was all guns blazing. He wanted to please Israel. Not that Biden doesn't want to do that, not that Obama didn't want good relations, not that all in modern history we know that the Americans are have very cordial relations with Israel. So it was basically Israeli pressure.
So you're of the view it was because of the Israeli pressure straight
Israeli
away?
pressure, yeah, one. And also because the Arabs were also not very happy with it. Even now we see that there is a unusual warmth between the Israelis and the Arabs. They are talking to each other, and they are making a joint front against Iran. So another nuclear power in the region, apart from Israel, could shift the power balance in the region. So the Arabs don't want it, Israelis don't want it.
So Dr. Yamin, your point is well taken. Let me take this point to Mr. Karel. Mr. Karel, do you agree with Dr. Yamin? Because was it because of the pressure from Israel in particular that Donald Trump reversed or backed away from the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, there's a part of that is absolutely true, but according to my research, the main lobby which put Trump into this on this course of events, it's called the Christian evangelicals, which is a very large part of the Christian voters which were backing Trump, and they're called the Christian Zionists. They are much more pro-Israel than most of the Israelis themselves, and they had a very big man in there, which was Sheldon Adelson, who now died, who was one of the main bankrollers who was paying for the campaign of Trump. So the people which were holding the shareholders of his campaign, they were always, they would call Trump at night and ask special favors and then give an extra donation to his campaign. So it's, you can not only blame the people of Israel, but we should blame a lot of the lobbies in the United States which are using Israel for their own political...
Okay, Mr. Karel, if for a moment we agree with this point that there was a pressure from Israeli authorities at that very time when Donald Trump reversed the Iran nuclear deal. So where was that pressure when Barack Obama was striking the deal with Iran? Were the lobbies not at work at that time also?
No, because the voting basis is less. Also, there's a part of the Israeli military which actually are in favor of the deal, which they don't agree with everything which was being played out by people like Netanyahu. And some of the Israeli military are pretty much in favor of working out a good deal and to solve this issue once and for all. They may be hardliners, they maybe don't like Iran, but they think this issue should be settled in another way.
Okay, Dr. Yamin, what's your view? Was there any expectation, since we saw the policy of maximum pressure and Donald Trump all blazing, as you mentioned, and he was trying to hit Iran very hard. We saw in the form of assassination of General Qasem Soleimani as well, but equal retaliation from the Iranian side as well, hitting the US bases in Iraq with dozens of soldiers getting brutal injuries as a result of that. So after having gone through those setbacks, do you think there was the realization in the Biden administration to show sincerity in order to revive that deal and mend their relations with Iran?
Hamid Saab, there's no sincerity in foreign relations, none whatsoever. These are stark national interests. There is no sincerity. So we know that the Iranian nuclear program has been attacked many times. It has been attacked through Stuxnet, which was basically an American and Israeli worm which was fed into the centrifuges, and it messed up with the Siemens command and control systems. Then, as you mentioned, that there have been a string of assassinations. One, we know Qasem Soleimani, but also we know that Israelis in particular have been killing Iranian scientists. We know that Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was killed in a daring attack near his home in Tehran. And some say that it was with the support of artificial intelligence backed weapons. And recently also one of the Iranian colonels, one by the name of Sayyid Khudai, was killed. So the attacks have been going on against Iran. Iran is well aware of it. Iran has been responding. Recently, Iran tried to attack some Israelis in Ankara, which was unfortunately, or fortunately, they couldn't do it. And it did spoil the relations with the Turks. So there has been attacks, there have been counterattacks, there have been cyber attacks, there have been assassinations. Iran is up against a very strong opposition. Biden does not want Iran to have a nuclear bomb. Nobody in America wants Iran to have a nuclear bomb. The Israelis absolutely, under no condition, under no circumstances, they have been actually prompting some of the administrations to actually carry out a kinetic attack against the Iranian facilities. And there have been instances when there have been reports of some kind of blaze in some reactors also. But so far, apart from the Stuxnet attack and other attacks, the Iranian nuclear program is still alive. It is not dead. They are now enriching their uranium.
But after the violation of the Iran nuclear deal,
and
during that deal, when
they were obeying,
they were not enriching uranium beyond those limits.
They were not violating, but since Trump pulled out, they have been enriching.
So Dr. Yamin, you mentioned a very interesting point, that there is no sincerity as far as the foreign relations is concerned. Let's talk about it with Mr. Karel. Mr. Karel, when we talk about, if I remember it rightly, on the sidelines of the UNGA session, there was a lot of talk about the possible meeting between the then President Donald Trump and the then Iranian President Mr. Hassan Rouhani as well. And there were reports which were actually reported by the Western media itself that it was President Donald Trump who was more of willing to have a one-on-one meeting with President Hassan Rouhani, but it was the Iranian side who were not interested until unless their fears or their concerns were actually addressed by the US side.
Well, the way Donald Trump was operating was to destroy any multilateral deals. So he was in principle already against the JCPOA because it was a multilateral deal which involved Russia, China, UK, France, Germany, and others. So he would only go for bilateral agreements. So he thought, since the US economy was supposedly the strongest economy of the world, if he's in a one-to-one relationship, then he could win in any situation, impose US interest. So that's and then what he thought, and the people behind him thought very disturbing, that the JCPOA was a deal for 15 years. And then, as you said, as my colleague said before, if you want to prevent at all costs, Iran to have nuclear power, then it takes much more than 15. Then you need you need something much heavier than this agreement, which is only a temporary agreement.
So when it comes to the role of the European countries in particular, we saw there were certain agreements between the European countries during the COVID-19 pandemic when the US hitting Iran with severe sanctions. We saw there were certain supplies and the supplies of the masks as well as certain other COVID-19 related equipment and other sort of things. So in the form of Instex, if I am right, that agreement was between Iran and the European countries. So what role they had been backing this particular deal? They wanted this deal to be revived at any cost. Of course, there would be some interest of the European countries. They wanted this deal to be revived. Why they couldn't push the US on the negotiating table at that particular point in time when Iran was willing, and on the face of it, the US was also willing, as I just mentioned earlier, that US President Donald Trump was willing to have one-on-one meeting with President Hassan Rouhani. So why couldn't the Europeans pull it off at that time?
Well, these things become, including between the US and Europe, there's a certain rivalry. It is true that Biden, having been the vice president of Obama, and Malay is an old hand of the Biden vice presidency, that they somehow, since they had built the whole election of Biden was based on the fact that he would do much better than Trump, and that he somehow has to deliver to make sure, something comes out of. He promised during the election campaign that he would come to an agreement. So the Europeans also made their own promises, and they have somehow, I don't think they were really out to give this as a victory to Biden, and they wanted to negotiate their own conditionalities, and because the issue will be.
And Mr. Karel, what were those conditionalities?
Just to finish, the issue will be once you lift the sanctions in Iran against Iran, who will have the right the most to develop and to start having economic trade relations with Iran then, and that's an issue on which Europe and the US do not really agree.
What were those major conditionalities, as you mentioned, of the Europeans?
No, what the Europeans saw is that officially there were US sanctions, but then they were applying these sanctions against the European countries, which could not build up the car industry. And while the Europeans were being kept out, actually there were secret, and there were all kinds of trade deals with Iran, favoring the US industry. So the Europeans were not very happy about the sincerity of this whole debate.
Okay, Dr. Yamin, what role do you think the European countries could have played during this entire saga?
The European countries were positively inclined toward Iran. There were countries like France who were looking forward to selling their aircraft to the Iranians, Boeings, etc. But we must be aware of the ground realities. United States of America is the most powerful country in the world. They have deployed nuclear weapons in Europe, and they provided extended deterrence to their European allies. So they cannot go against the wishes of the United States of America. And we have seen now in the conflict, Ukraine conflict, that the Americans have become stronger. They have, the NATO has been strengthened, and they have deployed forces in Romania. They have told the Europeans not to buy fuel from or gas from the Russians. So they've been able to prevail upon them. And we know that the Israeli Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister.
So you mean to say the equation is not that
There
is a huge dependency from the Europeans on the US, primarily for the security concerns?
Absolutely. They were dependent, they are dependent on security on the US, and they were dependent on energy on the Russians. On the Russians.
Dr. Yamin, it's a very, very important point. We'll discuss that one in detail later on in the show. I am now joined by Mr. Mustafa Khushcheshem from Iran on the phone line, who is Iran Affairs Analyst. Mr. Khushcheshem, thank you very much for your time at Views on News. So we have seen a new set of sanctions by the US on Iranian petrochemical and petroleum sector. The talks between the two sides have not come to any sort of fruition Do you see any sort of shift during the Biden administration from that of the Donald Trump administrations towards Iran nuclear deal and its revival in particular?
Hello, and thanks for having me. As a matter of fact, they're pursuing the same kind of maximum pressure policy. The United States is still adamant to compromise and to a deal. They have been in talks with Iran for quite a long time, and for the past 3 months, there's been some kind of war of willpower between the two sides, as the two sides are in quarrel over a number of issues. Removal of sanctions over hundreds of Iranian companies, firms, and entities, as well as providing Iran with guarantees to ensure that if Iran comes into a deal and enjoys some kind of economic profits, these economic profits would continue in future to have a stable deal. These two have remained the bones of contention, and all throughout the past 3 months, there has been some kind of, war of willpower. Since last month, or maybe 6 weeks ago, the United States has started a kind of hybrid warfare against Iran, starting with war of cognition, psychological warfare, cyber attacks, seizing Iranian crude cargo, as well as doing sabotage and assassination and terror attacks by Israelis, and some other moves like issuing a resolution at the IAEA's Board of Governors as a political and diplomatic leverage against Iran, all to push back Iran in the Vienna talks. But they have failed, and they have received Iran's reciprocal response to show them and to prove to them and to send them this message that the Rouhani era appeasement is done and is gone. And now, since President Raisi and his revolutionary cabinet took power, Iran has started into a new era of diplomacy to say enough is enough, and it goes for active resistance diplomacy and show of willpower and show of power to the other side and reciprocal moves in order to tell them that they cannot push Iran back. So Iran has reciprocated their hostile moves. So as you see, there has been some kind of war of willpower between the two sides. And these petrochemical sector sanctions that have been imposed last night, they're nothing compared to what Donald Trump imposed on Iran a couple of years ago. He imposed sanctions on the entire Iranian petrochemical sector, but he failed because petrochemical industries cargoes are smaller compared with the crude industry cargoes, and they include hundreds more interactions and trade and banking, deals. So it's very hard for the United States to, trace these banking interactions and deals. So they have failed to trace Iranian cargoes and Iranian deals and banking interactions, and especially considering that these petrochemical cargoes go to different regional states rather than all throughout the globe. And
Mr. Khushteshan, beg your pardon for the interruption. Regarding these set of sanctions by the U.S. on Iran at this point in time, and regarding the revival of Iran nuclear deal, there are certain statements coming from the U.S. authorities. Let me quote a couple of them over here. The Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, says that the United States has been sincere and steadfast in pursuing a path of meaningful diplomacy to achieve a mutual return to full implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Besides that, there is another statement by another official, Mr. Robert Matthews, Washington Special Envoy to Iran. He's saying that Iran had rejected the latest proposal backed by the European Union. Now, these both statements show the sincerity of the U.S. authorities in order to revive the Iran nuclear deal. What's your take on this?
Well, it's pretty well clear that they still continue this kind of, reluctance towards Iran. You know, since the talks have started since the talks have started, Iran has been the only party to help bring the talks out of the deadlock through its initiative plans and offers, frequent offers, including the one that Iran presented some 6 weeks ago. But the U.S. has been reluctant to help move the talks forward. They have been always adamant to bringing new initiatives to the talks. And as I said, 6 weeks ago when Iran offered a new initiative, in response, when Mora, the Deputy Foreign Policy Chief of the European Union, and his boss, Joseph Borrell, were happy were happy when they heard Iran's new initiative, the United States again showed reluctance and showed opposition and turned down the Iranian offer and started hybrid warfare against Iran. But this is not going to remain so. I do believe that there are multiple reasons to believe that in coming weeks, the United States would be forced to embrace realism and go for pragmatic moves. Since the crude prices would start rising as pre-cold season purchases start late in August or September, then the already rising prices would go even higher, and the markets in the Western Hemisphere would experience very more painful days, and they would have no way out. By the way, the midterm election in the U.S. is in the offing. The United States is rejecting providing Iran with the needed guarantees. They were the only ones that got out of the nuclear deal, and now no wise person or actor would go into the same deal with an irresponsible party that has already violated the deal. Now, especially this is the case because the Republicans that are very much vocal against the deal, they are going to most likely will win the majority of the two Senates in coming weeks, and Biden feels truly empty-handed to confront them. Now, first of all, if they win the majority in 3-4 months from now in both the House and the Senate, then they will torpedo the deal. That's another reason why Iran needs the guarantees. Another point is that the Biden administration is feeling very much empty-handed when it comes to economy in the U.S. election, in upcoming election. Also, with regard to the immigrant policy, he feels very much criticized by both parties. And also when it comes to foreign policy, with regard to Afghanistan, Iraq and the region, as well as China, Russia, North Korea, everywhere he has experienced failures. That's why he is experiencing the lowest rate of popularity and approval in the United States for the past 10 months. Now, the only chance he's got is the nuclear deal with Iran. Soon the Americans will, I believe, will come to realize that they are no more at the same kind of position that they used to be. There is a shift of leverage. There is a shift of situation soon to arise, maybe no more later than a few weeks, maybe mid-summer or late summer. They will be forced to embrace the realities. By the way, the U.S. priority is shifting to the South China Sea, and the U.S. is not as powerful as it used to be in the 1990s to fight triple enemies in the South China Sea, in Ukraine,
so Mr.
and in the
Khoshcheshan, as you
Middle East.
mentioned so many important points, do you think the U.S. authorities under the Biden administration would succumb to the shifting leverages?
It would be forced because, first of all, this maximum pressure policy campaign that they are pursuing originally started under Donald Trump, and they failed. And they have admitted their failure repeatedly. Now we are past the peak of the sanctions. The peak of the sanctions, the peak of the efficiency of the sanctions was rather 2 years ago. Ever since then, Iran has started rising in all economic indices, including crude exports. Iran is now exporting over 1 million to 1.5 million barrels of crude per day. and it has been able to, work out ways to bring the money back home. And now take a look at the
despite
Iranian
the
economy.
sanctions. And that's
Yes,
despite the
despite
sanctions.
the toughest sanctions ever imposed on the nation. And in addition, you could also see the rising cargoes of Iran's petrochemical industries. And in addition to that, since President Raisi took power, Iran has enhanced its foreign trade by 21%. That's a huge number. It shows pretty well that Iran is growingly, getting powerful in area of economy and foreign trade and foreign policy. Just take a look at Iran's, successes in the past 1 year. It has been accepted as a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was, President Raisi was the only president invited to, speak at the BRICS nations. And it's pretty well clear that the Chinese as well as the Russians have come to realize what Iran has been saying for the past 2 decades, that the U.S. is a wild cow, but you cannot tame it. You cannot do the maneuvers in order to avoid, this hostile nation. So the only way forward is coming closer to each other. So Iranian economy is going to experience better days soon, maybe in about 6-7 months from now, especially since late summer when, crude prices start rising. And the Americans know pretty well that their leverages, these are the final days of, the condition that they had. And soon we will have a shift of situation when they will be under more pressure. Take a look at gasoline prices in the United States and in Europe, and you will come to realize what's going on now.
Right. So at this point in time, very briefly, please, what role do you think the Europeans can play, especially when it comes to the revival of the Iran nuclear deal?
The Europeans have come to realize a number of points. In the last few months, they've been more active in area of diplomacy since the war in Ukraine started ravaging, and they experienced very, expensive prices in the markets, and their economic indices have started showing, threatening, numbers and dangerous numbers. And then they realized the United States policy is producing the most expenses with regard to the Ukraine war against Russia. It's producing the most expenses for the Europeans. They know that if they don't do anything about the energy crisis in the green continent, then they would have to shiver in winter. So they have started showing a more dynamic and more active role in order to bring Iran and the U.S. to the negotiating table. But we do believe that they need to pressure the United States more, because it's the United States that has remained adamant to a real deal. What they want is a deal in name, not in essence. That's why they have never shown any kind of flexibility.
Right, Mr. Mustafa Khushchesham, your point is well taken. Thank you very much for being with us on Views on News, joining us on a phone line from Iran International and Iran Affairs Analyst. We really appreciate your time. Now, Dr. Yamin, there were very important points which have been raised and mentioned by Mr. Khushchesham, and one of those points is that very soon, in a time span of 6 to 7 months, the U.S. is going to succumb to that very pressure when the crude prices are going to rise exponentially.
I think he's being over-optimistic. I don't think America is going to succumb to any kind of pressure. The Europeans have limited leverage. What we can do, Pakistan can do, we can connect the gas pipeline and start getting the gas from Iran, because we are in a problem. Our Prime Minister is going to go to Qatar. We have not been able to get any gas deal from LNG deal from anywhere in the world till now. And we are going to face a very difficult summer as well as a much more difficult winter. So I think we should take this as a silver lining and connect the gas pipeline.
So do you think it's going to be a very easily done a task, or it's going to be an uphill task?
It just needs to be connected. The only thing is that we are rightly so afraid of the United States of America, because they are going to impose sanctions on us. But we are already suffering from all kinds of preconditions which FATF has invoked on us. The IMF has yet to pay us any money. We are suffering from inflation of the highest kind. Our electricity tariffs have gone up. We are short of gas. So in my opinion, we should have a bilateral deal with Iran. We should pay them in rupees, and they should pay us, give us the gas. You see, we have just become a net importer of coal from Afghanistan. The balance of trade is in favor of Afghanistan right now, because you are importing coal from there. See, you are forced to.
So
Afghanistan is also not recognized by any country in the world. They are still very much a pariah state. So when push comes to shove, you have to take very drastic measures. So I'm not talking about how Iran is going to deal with them. I don't think the United States of America is going to ease any sanctions. I think it's too much.
Okay, Mr. Karel, what's your opinion on this? As Mr. Mustafa Khushcheshm was of the view that the US authorities are going to succumb to the shifting leverages, and because of the continuously rising prices of the crude in the international market and the Iranian economy thriving at the same time.
Yes, I fully agree with that, in the sense that both Europe and the US, with the price inflation, I mean, they are applying an embargo against themselves on gas and oil, which is increasingly provoking a very tough crisis on the price inflation on all the production, and not only energy. So at one point, there will be factions which will be in favor of having, at least to bring Iran on the market, so that countries which would be frightened to buy from Russia could buy their oil from Iran. There's another aspect which I think we somehow need to look more also to the big picture, which is the change of paradigm and the shifting of gravity from the transatlantic zone to the Eurasian continent. And this is also worrying some people in the transatlantic zone. For example, Iran, there was this deal with India, Iran, and Russia to do the north-south transport corridor, which started operating, and which would take trade out of the Suez Canal and out of the Bosporus. So this is shifting away. I mean, the trade routes are rapidly, and the Silk Road is rapidly reorienting, and Iran is fully included in this. Secondly, there is a move out of the dollar, because the trade already between Russia and Iran is done in national currencies, in rial and ruble, and then also the China. Since January, there is a huge increase in exchanges in yuan, where China is buying its oil in Iran and paying with yuan. So, and also, if you saw the sanctions yesterday, they're also aiming at Chinese operators, which were exactly shipping out the oil towards the east. So there's also a message in the sanctions that they want to, they're losing control. I mean, Iran is being integrated in the China, India, Russia combination and moving out of the dollar. So then we come in with the carrot and the stick. You know, on the one side we have the stick with the sanctions, but I think in reality there is some expectation that they want to really go, as my colleague said, especially before the midterm elections. If Biden wants to deliver, I think they somehow will have to work out the deal and make it work.
Right. Your point is well taken, and we have had in-depth discussion. This is a topic on which we can talk for hours. Unfortunately, we're short of time. Right now, Mr. Karel Vereycken, political analyst from Schiller Institute, Thank you very much for joining at Views on News on Skype from France, and Dr. Togrul Yamin, Senior Analyst, joining in the studio. Thank you very much for your time as well. With this, we come to the end of today's show's discussion. Until the next show, take very good care of yourselves.